Hi everyone, welcome to our DCitizens seminar series. As some of you may know, DCitizens is a project that is led by multiple people, including Hugo from Lisbon, Kyle Montague from Northumbria, and Marcus from Seeking, as well as colleagues in Genoa. And the whole idea of DCitizens is to foster and develop digital civics research and innovation in Lisbon. And so this seminar series is an exciting space for all of us to engage with experts in the field of digital civics, to ask questions, and also to hear about exciting research that should be informing the way that we do digital civics research. And for our first speaker, we have the brilliant Dr. Firaz Peer. Firaz is an assistant professor of information communication technology in the University of Kentucky, where he studies issues of accountability, justice, care, and equity that manifest when building, using, and maintaining algorithmic and data infrastructures, with a particular focus on working with marginalized communities, using participatory and design-based research methods, as well as scholarship from human-computer interaction and science and technology studies. Please know that this session is being recorded, and captions will be shared, and transcripts will be shared. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. The format is Firaz is going to present to us about his work and research, and we'll have a Q&A afterwards. Anna Carter will be moderating and curating that. So please kind of direct your questions in the chat, and then she'll take it from there after the Q&A. All right. Great. Firaz, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Reem. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And thank you for taking the time to make it to this talk. Like Reem said, Firaz Peer. I'm at the University of Kentucky. And the research I'm sharing with you today is based on work that I did in Atlanta. Again, this was using similar methods like Reem described, which are both participatory and grounded with a community that was there in Atlanta, which I'll talk more about in a bit. So the work that we did was we developed a community data dashboard, and it was a project that took a few years, and I'm going to focus here on the last bit, last bit of the work that we did. So the written part of this is still under review. So if you have any clarifications, questions, stuff that doesn't make sense to you, please feel free to ask me. I'd love to make those changes before the final paper is out. All right. So you might have guessed the focus for today is going to be on data. And data had become central to this historic West Side community in Atlanta. At the time when I was there, two of its neighborhoods, Wine City and English Avenue, consistently rank amongst the poorest in the US. And these neighborhoods actually once had a thriving middle-class population, but had fallen upon hard times thanks to several failed socioeconomic policies by the city. And combined with the economic downturn of the 90s, these neighborhoods had become home to abandoned lots and quite a few illicit activities. But Wine City is also the neighborhood that was home to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his family until his assassination in 1968. Pictured here is his home on Sunset Avenue in Wine City, which has been acquired by the National Park Service and has been made open to the public. The West Side neighborhoods are home to many such landmarks and have a rich legacy that goes back to the American Civil Rights Movement. More recently, these neighborhoods have become site to some intense economic activity thanks to some high-profile infrastructure projects like the Mercedes-Benz Stadium shown here on the top right and the West Side Park in the foreground. Individual and private enterprises have tried to profit from West Side's escalating real estate valuations, while nonprofit organizations and neighboring universities are working with the city to rebuild blighted neighborhoods, make them safer, and formulate policies that will protect longtime residents from being forced out of their homes. So these contrasting stories about the West Side are being captured in the media as well, and many of them tend to focus on the negative rather than the positive aspects of these neighborhoods. So local residents have and organizations have taken it upon themselves to change their neighborhoods as well as the narrative that gets told about them. And one such project was initiated by these community leaders was called the Historic West Side University Alliance Data Dashboard. This dashboard includes modules for education, public safety, transportation, history, environment, and other matters of concern. So the idea over here was to have data about each of these aspects on the dashboard. So anybody who's interested can come on here and use that data when advocating for change with the city. And I was involved in multiple modules through the development process. But again, like I said, for today's talk, I'll be focusing on the work we did to update the workforce development module. The goal with this module was to investigate if the various workforce training programs being offered by the city were actually helping the residents in their upward economic mobility. So in other words, the community leaders wanted to know if these workforce training programs were actually helping individuals and families afford to stay in these neighborhoods, or were they being pushed out due to the escalating real estate valuations. And in building this module, the research question that I was asking was, what is the context within which data are operationalized for use within resource-constrained communities? So all data are made with specific intentions and agendas in mind, and it's important that we understand what these are before making any claims about their objectivity. This framing implies that it's only when we observe the context of production of civic data that we can better understand their weaknesses and the kinds of conclusions we can draw from them, as well as the statistical claims that we make about them. Lukisas calls this the operational context of data, and excuse me, and he defines it as the culturally defined setting in which participants are equipped with the resources and subject roles necessary to access, interpret, and take action on predetermined objects of attention. Now, the objects of attention in this case are, of course, civic data. And the culturally defined setting includes the socio-technical infrastructure, as well as the human and the non-human actors, their roles, and the resources that are needed to operationalize data for use. So I went about determining the operational context of this data using ethnographic research methods that have origins both in fields of information science and participatory design. And I studied this dashboard not as a tool or an interface that needs to be evaluated, but as a socio-technical assemblage, which is influenced by and has influence on the context within which it's being developed. So the dashboard is part of an already existing information infrastructure that includes data sets and websites, institutions, policies, organizations that are part of this operational context. And the civic data guide served as a blueprint that I used in my ethnography with this data infrastructure. I go into a lot more detail, and I also have the link here that you can look up if you want to learn more about the civic data guide. But briefly, what it offers is a step-by-step process to think critically about how data sets are made in different settings. There's a 4-step process, which includes picking a data set and unpacking its setting, doing contextual interviews with people involved in creating and managing and using the data, creating data life cycle diagrams, and creating data visualizations to further explore the data visually. It was in following these steps that I identified the data intermediaries in the city who could give me the data I needed. I interviewed them and also worked with them to explore the data. So in using this civic data guide, this work also offers a methodological blueprint that others can use to unpack the operational context of such civic data. And my role in this project was that of a data investigator rather than that of an expert taking the lead in these affairs. So in working with community leaders, our goal was not for me to develop the workforce training module myself, but to develop it with the community by putting together a sustainable infrastructure, which could be managed and maintained by these community leaders after my involvement in this project ended. In my quest for data, I met with several data intermediaries who were experts and worked with the city, worked with data at the city, county, and state levels. I interviewed about 4 of these data intermediaries, and each of these interviews lasted between 60 to 90 minutes each. I obviously went back and did multiple interviews with them to understand exactly what the data are and how we can use them. Mark was another community leader who worked as he worked as a consultant and used software like Power BI as part of his day job. So he volunteered to work with me in building out this workforce training module. And the data I collected over here included my notes, the transcripts of the interviews, email exchanges with both the community leaders and the data intermediaries, as well as the data sets that I worked with. I analyzed this data using grounded theory, which resulted in codes like data work, invisible work, missing data, trust, barriers, competing priorities, and a lot more. And it was in refining these codes that I was able to identify the different forms of work, capital, and idiosyncrasies in the data. So the story I want to tell here today is about how I went about finding this data and the contingencies I faced in the process. So in the rest of this presentation, I want to focus on these specific forms of work, capital, as well as the data idiosyncrasies that I observed. So first up, infrastructure work. This has been has been used to refer to the work that individuals do when working within complex and fragmented infrastructures like healthcare. Yi and Chen have observed that infrastructure work in healthcare involved patients and their caregivers navigating the US healthcare infrastructure when trying to obtain care. I observed and engaged in similar kind of infrastructure work when trying to gain access to the Westside community's workforce training data. This included reaching out to various data intermediaries in the city to find the data I needed in a format that was both usable and shareable. This kind of work involves navigating the infrastructure to find exactly what one needs, and this rarely gets described or accounted for within research, but as many of you might already know, is a key component of doing such work in civic settings. Then there was the work that went into actually putting together the specific platforms we could use to build out the workforce training module. This involved the work of infrastructuring, which included the work I did in my capacity as a facilitator in setting up the Google platform so we could work collaboratively to store, analyze, and visualize the data. The infrastructure included Google's Data Studio, which is kind of like Tableau or Power BI, and it focuses on the visualization and the analysis of data. Google Drive to host the data, and it tends to work pretty seamlessly with Data Studio, and Google Groups to communicate with those who are involved in this process. And we decided to use the Google Suite because the learning curve with a lot of their products is not as steep as something like Tableau or Power BI. And the community leaders were already familiar with many of these products. I also set up a data ambassadors program with the intention of recruiting a group of individuals from the community who could help develop the module and serve as points of contact for all data-related queries going forward. And the work of the infrastructuring of work, which is slightly different, involved modifying our work practices so we could work within the constraints of these platforms and the data that we had. This meant relearning how to format the data, get it into Google's Google Drive and Studio, excuse me, and learning the specifics of working with this new platform, and also figuring out the kinds of permissions and access that people have. Excuse me. Sorry, it's the allergies here. Oh my God. So this process wasn't entirely straightforward, and there were several contingencies that we had to overcome. One such contingency was the accuracy of the data itself. So as I learned from the interviews that I did, some of the data that we are looking for was lost or not properly captured when translating it from the old Department of Labor database to a new geographic solutions database. The fact that this new system assigned a new row for each service that these participants used impacted the kinds of analysis and insights we could draw from the data. And we had to account for these duplicate rows when counting the total number of participants who had completed the program. So these duplicate rows led Mark to email me and say that I hope the new data you get will be better. I had hoped to use this data set, but I cannot find any useful or trustworthy information from it other than acceptance completion related related filtering. And now it appears that even that may be for that race numbers may be bogus. So this really made him lose trust in the data. And so I had to go back and try to clarify these issues and get better or cleaner data that we could use. But Lukisas argues that while such idiosyncrasies may seem like errors in the data, they are important signifiers of local data collection and cleaning practices that can be helpful for analysis and should not be erased from the data set. So these idiosyncrasies pointed to coding practices, data rituals, and program policies that form the basis of articulation work, which is mostly performed within formalized structures of institutions and organizations. Such articulation work involved experts using specialized software and scripting languages to capture and produce data in formats that we could use. For instance, the workforce training data we needed was distilled from a much larger set of government data that was meant to inform policies at the city and state level. Giving us the data required that these data intermediaries run specific scripts in SQL and other scripting languages, which was beyond the scope of any of the beyond the scope of the work that the community leaders could do by themselves. I've highlighted the address column here, here because that was one column we could not get access to due to privacy concerns. And getting access to this column required us to have a data sharing agreement with the city, which was not something I could put together during the course of this project. So this draws attention to the specific forms of capital that are required in the data infrastructuring process. The data intermediaries had specific forms of technical capital that allowed them to work with the data and give it to us in specific formats. The community leaders I was working with had the social, cultural, and bonding capital, which gave them in-depth knowledge of the community's needs and concerns. And in my role as a data investigator, I mostly relied on my technical and social capital to network with these community leaders and work with the data that I received from them, from the data intermediaries, rather. So coming back to this original question of what is the context within which data are operationalized for use within within resource constrained communities. Sorry. So the data under construction here was embedded in Atlanta's west side. And my goal in unpacking the operational context was to better understand how this context of production impacts their value, use, and the kinds of claims that we can make with the data. And determining this context required that I investigate the settings from which the data are extracted. So determining this context required that I investigate the settings from which data are extracted, speak with people who created the data, so we could account for their biases and limits. So the operational context that I describe here, which includes the various forms of work, capital, and data idiosyncrasies, was limited by my own positionality as a researcher, the manner in which I was embedded in the community, as well as the kinds of access that I had. Other researchers who are embedded differently would probably navigate this data infrastructure in ways that would reveal other contextual elements that could contribute to our collective understanding of how civic data are operationalized. So it's important to remember that operationalizing data in civic contexts is a dynamic, situated, and complex endeavor. So this implies that the resources and roles required to make data accessible and actionable are always different and vary from one context to the other. As researchers and practitioners working with civic data, this should give us pause to think about how one might approach such data infrastructures, navigate its various socio-technical elements, and how it influences the resources we might need to operationalize data.